Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the first of two videos, and we're going to do something a little bit different because there's a lot of information to address today. So I'm going to this is going to be a two-part series. Why I decided to do this 1 week after another rather than the 2-week gap that we typically have. And it's just because there's so much information tied into this and there's so much value for you. I didn't want this to be something that I rushed through or just took too much time out of your day trying to pack it into one longer session. And the one thing I want to bring up with this, if you're watching this live, you'll have a couple minutes because I'm going to review some things at the beginning. Definitely have a pad of paper and a pen handy. So if you don't have one ready, go grab one for yourself. And also, if you're watching the replay of this, definitely just pause this and have a pad of paper and a pen handy. There's going to be so much information really on both part one and part two. But really part one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into explaining the physiological and functional dynamics of what I'm talking about today. And in part two, which is going to be the very next week, I'm going to describe what you can do to improve what we're talking about and to potentially find your own balance from this level. So let's get right into this. We're going to talk about blood sugar on a level that I'd be willing to say you've never heard blood sugar talked about before. And I confidently say that because when I first, really understood this information, this is like the cutting edge information on blood sugar and how it impacts the whole of your body, not just about like insulin resistance and or diabetes. This is really about, it's about your whole being, and you're going to understand this today. Now, also, as we're going through this, initially, I want to give you a little bit of review of things that we've talked about with blood sugar in the past. Now, blood sugar from a standpoint for conventional medicine, unfortunately, when it comes into blood sugar, they're only concerned about blood sugar through looking at blood work, and very often they're just looking at glucose, which is a very incomplete understanding of blood sugar. Now, glucose is the sugar that's in the blood, but it's so incomplete because what's important to understand is that your body has to maintain, to be in its best of health, you have to maintain a very narrow range of blood sugar. I would typically say somewhere between 75 and 95. It could vary depending on you individually. Some people are best between 75 and 85. Some people are best from like 80 to 90, and some are best from like 85 to 95. And so that does depend on you individually. But a good rule of thumb is understand somewhere between like 85 and 90, or 75 and 95, and preferably like 75 to 90. Now, when your blood sugar starts to go up, right now, because it's so important for you to maintain a very narrow range of blood sugar, you have two different steroidal hormones that are produced in your body. One's called insulin. That's what most people have heard about. Insulin is a steroidal hormone that removes blood sugar from your blood. And so if your blood sugar is too high, you'll produce more insulin to bring your blood sugar down, right? Now, the opposite though, because it's also not good to have blood sugar too low. So the antagonist to insulin is another steroidal hormone called glucagon. And the job of glucagon is if your blood sugar is too low, your body will produce more glucagon to take the stored glycogen in your body and release it into your blood to raise your glucose levels. So if they're too high, you produce more insulin to lower it. And if you're too low, you produce more of the, I lost my word there, the glycogen. I'm sorry, the insulin, and that's kind of funny. I forgot the word I just said. But anyway, you'll produce more of that antagonistic steroidal hormone to bring that level up. So if this mid-level is where you want to be, it's too high, insulin lowers it. If it's too low, the glucagon, it came back to me, the glucagon will bring it up. All right, now, so the problem if you only look at glucose, so let's say that your glucose is normally, let's just say right kind of in the middle, 70, 85. So if your glucose is normally 85, but your insulin level only has to be at like a 2 to maintain that, that's awesome. I mean, that's really where you want to be because your glucose is healthy and your insulin levels are really low to maintain that. So that tells me that your body is taking care of its glucose on its own, probably because you're eating well and you're getting some exercise, you're dealing with any inflammatory triggers in your body, and you're just doing the things you need to do to be healthy, right? So that's a glucose at 85. This is an insulin level of 2. So now let's say that there's some changes in your diet that are adding more sugar. You know, maybe you're eating more processed carbohydrates like flour-based products, or maybe you're drinking a lot of fruit juice or sodas, or just something that's going to make your blood sugar rise. Okay, so if your blood sugar goes up and you're at 85 and it goes up to 90, but down here at 85 and an insulin of 2, well, now when your blood sugar starts to go up, to get it back down to 85, your insulin levels will go up. So if this is at 85, it goes up to 90, and then your insulin was 2, and now your insulin is at 5 to keep it at 85. But now let's just say the diet is still poor. There's still a lot of processed carbohydrates. You're not exercising like you used to. And now there's some inflammatory triggers that are also driving the glucose up. So now your insulin is up to like 95 or 100. And now or your glucose is at 95 or 100, now that insulin that was initially at 2 that went up to 5 to maintain this before, now maybe that insulin has to go up to 10 to get it back down to about like 88. So this can go on for a number of years, sometimes a decade, where your glucose isn't moving that much, but your insulin is like out of control high. And so a lot of times when doctors are only looking at glucose, it's really an incomplete understanding, because you can watch insulin levels rise for years, if not a decade, long before you see like really major changes in glucose. So you can understand when you're getting into what we would consider an insulin resistance and a pre-diabetic condition long before diabetes is ever really recognized. And then the other thing that I want to mention too is that now, outside of glucose, some doctors are being more proactive now, and they're also looking at something that's called A1C. Now, A1C is a great marker. Now, what's interesting though is conventionally they usually utilize A1C for a diabetic marker. But here's something that's important to understand. You may have heard me talk about this before, but this is a key point for everybody, is that if your body's inflamed, so let's say, and we're going to talk about that later. So if you're dealing with chronic inflammation, and to a little note, that's called an NF-kappa beta state. It's NF-kB. So that's what chronic inflammation is more technically referred to as. So if you have this chronic inflammation, what that's going to do, and might be a good thing to write down because there's a lot of people stuck in the cycle, and you could be yourself as well, is that when you have excess inflammation in your body, that's going to then trigger an increase in fat cell production. So your fat cell production is increased. Now from there, that leads to what's called insulin resistance. And then from insulin resistance, it triggers insulin surges. And then ironically, those insulin surges create more inflammation. So you get stuck in that hamster wheel, right? The inflammatory hamster wheel that so many people are living with on a consistent basis. So when we think of A1C, A1C is actually a better understanding of how inflamed you are, with the knowledge now that when you're inflamed, it's going to trigger insulin resistance and insulin surges. So that's why conventionally they do look at it as more of a long-term blood sugar marker, but it's really more of an understanding if you're inflamed, and that inflammation is actually wreaking havoc on your blood sugar. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Now, from there, now that's what conventionally they'll look at. They'll look at glucose all the time, and sometimes A1C. But that's so incomplete, and it's an understanding that it's just about, whether you're pre-diabetic or you have insulin resistance, pre-diabetic or diabetic. And the problem with that is that there's an understanding that's just about diabetes. Well, what you're going to find out today is it's so much more than that. Now, even prior to me getting this new and this cutting edge information, I was already going further because, typically when you think about blood sugar, if you've ever been to a doctor and the doctor's told you that your glucose is too high or your A1C is too high or a combination of both, and they would typically say, well, you have to eat better and you have to exercise. So eating better would typically mean that you're not, drinking sodas, you're not getting in any liquid sugar, you're really cutting back on the carbohydrates, you're getting rid of flour-based products, you're focusing on eating protein, vegetables, and also good quality fats on a consistent basis. And then you get out and do some exercise. Maybe you go work out. Maybe you start going for longer walks. You get engaged in some kind of sport that provides a lot of exercise for you, but whatever that may be. And that's the conventional model. The conventional model is, let's look at your glucose, and if it's too high, we're going to tell you to exercise and we're going to tell you to eat better. And then if you come back and your glucose hasn't improved, we're going to chastise you for saying that, well, you must not be eating well or exercising like I told you to. And that's such an incomplete answer. And we're here at Depke Wellness, we've already gone further, in the past, where you have the understanding of it's not just about how you eat and whether you exercise or not. This is also tied into these inflammatory responses, these triggers, and this chronic inflammation. It's driving the insulin resistance and the insulin surges. So you could be eating, you could have gotten those directions from your doctor and eliminated all processed carbohydrates, just drinking water and eating protein and eating lower glycemic vegetables and eating good quality fats. And you're out exercising and walking every day and doing all the things you know to do. And it gets so frustrating when you go back to your doctor and they're like, oh, well, you must not be following what I recommended. But the simple fact is you're inflamed, and then the inflammation is triggering this whole response, right? So that's the extent of where I've taken it in the past, all right? But that's the past. Today is a new day and there's new information. And this is where it's just so amazing for me to share. Now, the first thing that I want to bring up is the depth at which we're going to get into this. I'm going to help you understand how really your blood sugar is and what's going on with regulating blood sugar is impacting your whole body. And it's tied into something that's referred to as AMPK. So if you want to write that down, Apple, Mary, Paul, Kitten. And AMPK is an acronym for something called adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. All right, that's more than a mouthful, right? So we'll just stick with AMPK through the rest of the time. And what I want you to understand, though, is AMPK is known as the master regulator of cellular energy homeostasis, as tied into what's going on from a blood sugar standpoint. So AMPK, it basically exerts its metabolic effects through the influence on your own genetic and gene transcription, and interacts with a whole group of various different metabolic pathways, such as glucose uptake, insulin sensitivity, lipid and glucose metabolism. So when I talk about lipid, we're talking about fat metabolism. Also, AMPK activates and mimics the effects of a calorie restriction and vigorous exercise. So when your AMPK is up, your body actually has the same positive impacts from a weight loss perspective as if you're doing calorie restriction or exercising very, very rigorously. Also, AMPK activation. So when you increase your AMPK, it extends the lifespan as seen in laboratory animals in research. So that's, I don't know, that's for somebody, I'm 55 right now. You might be watching this when I'm 60, I don't know, but as the replay. But yeah, I'm all about extending lifespan, and also, but not just extending lifespan, extending a vibrant, healthy lifespan is a key. Now, in your youth, AMPK has more activation. And as we age, AMPK has less activation. Now, I'm not going to say that when you're younger, you just have more AMPK. What I believe is that the reason why there's less activated AMPK when we're older is because we've spent more years really often doing things incorrectly for our body. Like we're just not taking care of ourselves. We're not focusing on our fundamentals of health. We're still eating things that are triggering inflammation. We're dealing with infections. We have all these hormone imbalances. We've got these gut-brain immune connective issues. We've got all this chronic like all these different things are going on. So of course, AMPK is going to be less activated. Now, the cool thing though, that I want you to understand is kind of the effects of AMPK in your body, right? So when AMPK is higher, AMPK stimulates a lot of positive aspects for yourself. It actually stimulates your hypothalamus. Now, in the past, if you've listened to any of my trainings on the HPA axis and tied into adrenal balance, the hypothalamus plays a role also down the pathway for your adrenal-based hormones. So things like cortisol and cortisone, also the production of pregnenolone, all the different estrogen hormones, testosterone, andro, like all of that is tied into the hypothalamus as well. But specifically with AMPK, this actually stimulates the hypothalamus, which then what's interesting is the hypothalamus then will lower your appetite, and it's also going to have a positive impact on your beta and your pancreas and beta cells. So the AMPK is going to then lower your insulin secretion. So we got two positives already from, well, three positives, four to be exact, as I'm counting. The AMPK stimulates the hypothalamus. Now, of course, that's going to also help your whole HPA axis on hormones, but it's also going to lower your appetite. The AMPK is going to stimulate your pancreas and beta cells within your pancreas, which is going to lower your insulin secretion. And then it's also going to have a positive impact on your muscular activity, which is going to help you with your own energy expenditure. And it's also going to have a positive aspect on adipose tissue, which is going to improve your fatty acid metabolism. So if your AMPK improves, there's less desire for food, lowers your appetite, lowers your insulin secretion, which we talked about the importance of that earlier. It increases your energy expenditure, and it increases your fatty acid metabolism, which also, just to understand, when we've talked about keto in the past, when you burn fat for fuel as compared to glucose, there's much more energy production in your body. You actually enjoy about 6 to 7 times more energy breaking down and utilizing fatty acid metabolism rather than carbohydrate metabolism for energy. And fatty acid metabolism is also much cleaner fat. It doesn't create as much free radical activity and oxidative stress as carbohydrate metabolism. So the end result of this, when your AMPK is improved, your overall metabolic health, you have healthy insulin and glucose metabolism, you have healthy lipid metabolism, which is fat metabolism, significant increase in energy, and ease of weight management. Now, think about that. Who doesn't want that, right? And this is the one thing. I mean, this goes so much deeper than we've typically understood when we're talking about glucose in the past. And there's really even so much more with this. And so let me get which slide I want to focus on first here. Okay. So there's a whole physiological web of excess glucose. So I was talking about that earlier, where if your glucose is too high, it's gonna trigger the more insulin production, and then if you still haven't changed your habits or changed the triggers for that, that's going to keep going. Now, that was just the one thing we understood in the past, but there's so much more, and this is a great place to be taking notes in this area as well. So overall, when your glucose levels go up, now down the one pathway that we're more accustomed to understanding is when your glucose levels go up, your insulin receptors are going to be more eventually become more resistant. And what this is going to do, it's going to create these insulin surges we talked about before. Now, to go a little bit deeper with this is if there's, for a male who the insulin surges kick up, this can create a hormone shift to where estrogen levels start to go up. This excess insulin for men can also lead to an increase in an enzyme called aromatase, and that enzyme converts testosterone into estrogen. So you can have men who maybe they're getting more fleshy tissue around their breast area, maybe getting a little softer around the stomach, maybe becoming a little bit more emotionally unstable, and maybe a little less motivation. Very often it's just tied into excess estrogen, and that's not good for men, because not only is that a risk factor for prostate cancer, and for men it's also a risk factor for breast cancer as well. Right now, if for women though, if there is a hormonal shift due to insulin surges, that actually leads to something similar yet different, is that can lead to a production of 1720 lyase, which then increases testosterone. And that's very, very common. I've had so many clients in the past that are dealing with PCOS, and PCOS almost always has this elevated glucose, insulin receptor resistance, insulin surges, and then this production of the 1720 lyase that actually increases the testosterone. Now, what's interesting with this is the increased estrogen in men and the increased testosterone in women trigger more insulin surges. So, and again, it's almost like that what we were talking about earlier with how the inflammation creates that feedback, or that hamster wheel. So these insulin surges can do the same thing when it starts affecting elevated estrogen in men and elevated testosterone in women. And what's interesting too is I'll even bring back later how the inflammation could also trigger these same changes in estrogen and testosterone for men and women as well. All right, so now that's the one level that in the past most people had somewhat of an understanding of, but there's so much more with this. Now, also when your glucose levels go up, it's also going to increase your cortisol response. You've heard me talk about cortisol probably many times in the past due to adrenal testing, or as I mentioned earlier, the HPA axis, and cortisol going too high is a definite issue, because it weakens the immune system function, it accelerates the aging process, it creates a lot of other issues. And when cortisol stays high for too long, eventually the hormonal system just can't keep up, and then you just crash and burn, and then you're dealing with very low cortisol, which then leaves your body in a definite deficiency from a functional perspective, really holistically in your body. Now, the other thing that when your glucose levels go up and the cortisol goes up, it also triggers the other hormones, actually andro specifically, to go up as well. And then these two responses can actually create a functional pH acidosis. It can create an electrolyte imbalance, and you're going to start to feel really poor. You're going to start to feel really low energy, like things are going to start to fall apart for you. And because of the cortisol being such a regulator for so many other factors in your body, it can lead to so many different things. It can lead into issues for women with their ovaries, for men or women with their thyroid. It can create some issues with immune regulation, just you name it, it's going to create a problem down that level. So that's the other understanding. Now, the other aspect tied into glucose levels going up is when the glucose is up, it's actually going to create an activation of that NF-kappa beta, the NF-kB. That's the chronic inflammatory response. One of the things that, when I'm talking about inflammation, and I know there's past membership calls on inflammation, and I talk about one of the triggers for inflammation is the standard American diet, the SAD diet, SAD, which is high in sugar and processed carbohydrates and sugary drinks and caffeine and alcohol, which then triggers the inflammation. Right now, outside of the things we've already talked about with inflammation before, there's different things that the chronic inflammation could also trigger. this could cause something called a microglia activation. And you don't need to remember microglia activation, but what I want you to know that when you activate this microglia, it creates neuron degeneration. And I know this is a big concern for so many people. I've done some surveys on this on social media. I asked this very specific question for women who are around the ages of 45 to 55. The question is, what is it that you most fear about aging? And by far, the number one concern and worry about aging were things like dementia, Alzheimer's, just any kind of neurodegeneration, to where you potentially stop recognizing your friends, your loved ones, your family, and heck, yourself. And that's not a place that anybody wants to go. And that chronic inflammation triggers that neuron degeneration. Now, the other aspect is when you have this NF-kappa beta activation, it basically destroys your intestinal permeability. Now, your intestinal permeability is basically the interior lining of your gastrointestinal system, the interior lining of your stomach, the interior lining of your small intestines, the interior lining of your colon. Now, where it becomes the biggest issue, though, is with your small intestines. When you start to have intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut, what it does is it leads to dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of bacteria. And when you start to have leaky gut and you have this intestinal permeability, it creates gaps in the cells of the mucosal lining that are too large, to the point where you're not just letting through nutrients anymore. You're not just letting through fats and proteins and carbs and vitamins and minerals and enzymes and coenzymes. When you start to have this intestinal permeability and leaky gut, you're now letting whole food particles through to get into your blood, which then basically creates an autoimmune type of reaction, driving more inflammation and leading to autoimmune disorders. All right, so that's a big deal, right? And then also the chronic inflammation and also the dysbiosis, that bacterial imbalance with the intestinal permeability, both of these trigger then what's called hepatic biotransformation impairment, which then affects your liver's ability to detoxify properly. So now your body can't get rid of toxins properly through the phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification pathways, and you throw the toxins on top of this, there's end result byproducts. Now, ironically, this hepatic biotransformation impairment also has a similar effect as the insulin surges, where it can actually increase estrogen in men and testosterone in women. So you start to get down all these different, it's no longer just one hamster wheel that people are running in. Now it's like several hamster wheels you're running in. And there's one other piece of this puzzle and this is the one thing that I talked a little bit on earlier, is the other impact that the glucose levels, that elevated glucose has, is it raises something called leptin. You've probably heard people talking about leptin online a little bit more recently, because it's such a big thing tied into weight loss. But leptin leads to the hypothalamic leptin resistance, which then increases your appetite. So when you get stuck in this low AMPK and your glucose levels are going up, not only is this creating all these issues down with the insulin and the excess estrogen or testosterone for men and women, also triggering the cortisol and the hormone response and creating the neurodegeneration and leading down to the leaky gut and creating all these issues from that. But this is also that hypothalamic leptin resistance increases your appetite. So even if this is for the people, you feel like you're doing it right. You feel like, wow, I'm all over my Depke ketosis and I'm eating really well and I'm out there exercising, and why am I still so hungry all the time? Why is it that my husband, or why is it that my wife can eat so much less than me and so less often, and I'm always just dying for my next meal, right? And it's tied into this leptin resistance in the hypothalamus. So, in essence, I really want you to understand with this part 1, the impact that this has on the whole of the body. And lastly, before I finish up on really what's going on with this for today, as far as like what this is about and what this is causing in the body, I want to give you an understanding of how this interaction with the AMPK and the chronic inflammation and the leaky gut and all of this really ties in together. So this creates a lot of different imbalances in the body. So an imbalance in lipase, which is fat in your body, an increase in leptin, estrogen, higher estrogen in males, higher testosterone in females, interleukin 6, which is an immune response. But that doesn't have as much of a high level importance for you as do the symptoms that you could be dealing with. All right, so, and this is where, and I'll go through these somewhat slowly so you can at least jot down the ones that you might be dealing with. So this could lead to weight gain and obesity. These triggers can lead to chronic pain, can lead to migraines. It can lead to diabetes, can lead to thrombosis. This can eventually lead to having a stroke or hypertension. Muscle atrophy, where you start to lose more, an unhealthy level of muscle. This can lead to infertility. This can lead to depression. This can lead to chronic inflammation. Challenges such as asthma or arthritis or osteoporosis. This can also cause sleep apnea or arteriosclerosis. Any type of cardiovascular type of disorder. So when you just think about what people are dealing with, maybe even potentially what you're dealing with, I want you to understand the depth that this ties into AMPK. And what the one thing that, like when you learn new information, and I don't know if you're like this, but I'm like this for sure, is that for me, there's sometimes like that one thing that is like the golden nugget you learn from something. And where this was so encouraging for me, and I don't say just for myself, when I look at, when I learned this myself, I mean, I started doing some things to improve my AMPK, for sure. But the one thing that was very exciting for this for me is because with the way that I learned this about the AMPK, is that for people who seem to be having a tougher time really reaching their level of optimal health, even though they've put forth a lot of, potentially time, money, and effort in reaching improved health, the lack of the AMPK, so too low of the AMPK and these glucose issues can actually hinder you from reaching your goals. Yeah, so that's why I really wanted to do this comprehensive enough. And I wanted to do this close enough with the two-part series. So this is we're getting towards the end of part 1. And with this, I just want you to understand with the end of part 1 that today what I did is I got to what this is all about. I wanted to take the time without rushing myself or rushing you to be able to help you understand how this is impacting your body on a significant holistic level. And what we'll do next week is we're going to get into the dietary as well as the supplement recommendations that you could do and to utilize to potentially improve what's going on from a low AMPK factor. So next week is going to be equally as exciting as this week, maybe more exciting because that's when you really get the answers of all of this. But if you're watching this live or if you're watching the replay of this, there's a lot of information in here. And if you weren't able to keep up with the notes, I would recommend that you watch the replay again until you feel like you're really comfortable with really what this is all causing in your body. Because this has an impact for me, it has an impact for you, and it has an impact for everybody that we all care about as human beings. So this is really important information, and I couldn't wait to share. By all means, once you've watched the replay on this, after this has been sent to you, if you have any questions with anything that I brought up on this particular training, just reply to the email and ask your question, make your comment. I'll be more than happy to get back with you personally. So I enjoy this information and look forward to next week when I'm going to give you the answers on how to raise your AMPK and change these dynamics in your body and in your life. All right, take care.